I've been thinking about video game progression a lot lately. Way of the Samurai's odd structure has been a big part of that, but the Archipelago multi-world system has also really captured my attention. Both of these gaming experiences require the player to be far more active in seeking relevant progression, be it determining which clue they should follow up on in Rokot's Pass, or assessing what their current loadout allows them to achieve within the multi-world. When presented with a choice in either setting, familiarity goes a long way to selecting the best path to follow. I know which locations open up to me whenever I get hold of the Monarch Wings, but I have no idea if finishing Dona's haiku with the omelette line actually makes a difference. As far as I can tell, it just makes Dona assume Japanese people suck at poetry. Unlike Archipelago, Way of the Samurai isn't randomized upon game start. It isn't a roguelike or anything. Instead, Acquire have designed a game that revolves around the player making a big decision once an hour, then following that thread to its conclusion. And for some, a branching narrative adventure where small differences in action have a butterfly effect impact that leads to different outcomes for the story overall, is the platonic ideal of a video game story. For others, Way of the Samurai looks like a cynical attempt at getting the most amount of game for the lowest number of assets. Whichever the case, the game structure is totally unique, and absolutely makes it worth revisiting today. Released in 2002, exclusively for the PlayStation 2, Way of the Samurai is a 3D action-adventure game that follows a traveling Ronin as they stumble into the end of an era. The Rokot's Pass is undergoing a rapid change of governance, whether the people present know it or not, and the player is allowed to navigate the upheaval in a broad number of ways. Whenever the player transitions between scenes, the day advances slightly, and, depending on the time of day, the player can catch and participate in a variety of events that inform how their adventure will end. Will they fight this crew of troublemakers? Ignore them? Or maybe attempt to get involved in whatever they're up to? If things don't quite go to plan, the player might end up helplessly tied to the train tracks, or even recruited as cannon fodder in an upcoming battle. The game features 3 major factions in the Rokot's Pass that are all willing to accept the player as a member on a whim. There's the Kuro family, the current top of the hierarchy, a de facto dictatorship who shake down the villagers in the valley for protection money and resources. Then there's the Akadama clan, who have recently moved into Rokot's Pass with the intent to dethrone the Kuro family and take control of the region for themselves. And finally, there are the villagers who live in the valley, most of whom have been chased away by the 2 gangs, but a handful are still present and trying to scrape out a life amidst the chaos. The player is free to join and oppose any and all of these groups, leading them through a variety of circumstances with compounding effects. Way of the Samurai also boasts a complex sword fighting system, with 40 different weapons and over 200 attacks, which seems ridiculous and kind of difficult to understand. But most of those attacks aren't necessary, and some might even be exclusive to the PvP fighting mode. Or maybe they are useful on higher difficulties. I don't know. I just wanted to see the different stories. At this point, I would normally provide some kind of biography for the developers to help set the scene. Something to introduce the real main character to this narrative. Because games don't just emerge from the ether and install themselves onto 2001 gaming-compatible hardware. Someone had to make them. But I've run into a bit of a problem. Acquire's strange online presence. The company was founded in the late 90s, and quickly made its way onto the Japanese stock exchange, where it was then acquired by a larger company, and then later sold to another media conglomerate, while forming partnerships with other game developers along the way. Not only is the history of Acquire obscured behind language barriers and corporate acquisitions, But at some point, a bunch of false information made its way onto their online profiles throughout various databases, including things like Western names being credited for work that was most likely done by a Japanese person, as the credits in the game would suggest. In a similar vein, I would have thought it appropriate to write a bio for the Archipelago developers, who have done some tremendous technical wizardry to have created such a robust, generation-spanning machine. But much of the project's early history is mired in sour politics and the egos of people working on a similar but separate computing marvel. Not only that, but the vast majority of game compatibility work within the Archipelago project was done by community members. Talented and determined individuals who just had to bring randomized Landstalker to the masses in a way that also adds cooperative multiplayer. I don't think I'd be able to do justice briefly covering so many incredible people who have delivered to me my favorite multiplayer gameplay experience of all time, but I am going to gush about it for a bit. You can only really play your favorite games so many times before you start to forget what made it so special in the first place. The deeper one's familiarity with a world, the more likely exploring becomes routine, most enemies turn into annoyances, and the story eventually grinds to dust. I love Hollow Knight, and I've played it a lot, but I haven't really touched the vanilla game in a couple years. I know where to go, and where to avoid until later, which means Hollow Nest's wonder and mystery are gone. Until Silksong comes out, randomizers help to restore some of that mystery, while also requiring creative routing through a part of the world that probably hadn't been designed for the player's current mobility tools. Combine all of that with Doom's items, randomized Minecraft recipes, and a Super Metroid playthrough, and suddenly it's all new again. The Dung Defender's Stinky Charm doesn't drop from the ceiling of the room after he gets Team Rocket blasted into the distance. This time it's a BFG, or the Bucket Recipe, or the 80th pack of missiles.
Wow!
The system even saves the multi-world progress, so one player can load up a playthrough of all 56 currently supported games, and even throw 15 extra playthroughs of Kingdom Hearts 2 because you just love Donald Duck so goddamn much, you fucking lunatic Disney adult maniac. And Archipelago will let you log in and out whenever you want. But it's also possible to play simultaneous multiplayer too. Colloquially known as sync games, a group of players hop into a voice channel and communicates which items they need and when, so the other members of the group can go collect them. And with the right settings, most groups can get a full multi-world done in around 2 hours, which is crazy. It genuinely breathes new life into some of my most played out games, and I seriously cannot recommend it enough. The website has a list of every compatible title, and I'll also put a link to the Discord server in the description in case you want to try it out and craft your own stories. But now, back to drudgery. Aside from the Ronin's death, and the Ronin just leaving on their own, there are 6 endings to find within Way of the Samurai, which itself is a bit of an illusion. I'd argue that there are only 2 significantly different endings that don't just change when each major character is killed. Every storyline is only an hour long, and none of them are that special or interesting individually, so I'm not spoiling anything of consequence. The first ending I found, and I think the most natural path to follow, would be siding with the villagers in the station. When the player enters the game world, the very first event they'll come across is an attempted kidnapping on the bridge. Stopping to rescue Suzu momentarily swerves the Kuro family-related paths, since Tsubohachi won't let the player enter the territory after this confrontation. Winning the battle isn't necessary since Donna will save Suzu if the player fails to, and surrender only detours the player slightly, provided they manage to convince passerbys to untie them. After some relatively unimportant posturing between the various clans in the area, the player convinces Suzu, her grandfather, Dojima the blacksmith, and Donna to follow them out of the station, and then the credits play. This is probably the best ending, where all the sympathetic characters get to live, but it's massively underwhelming. It takes an hour or so to convince 4 people that maybe they should leave the Rokots Pass, and then they do. The other paths all end with the Ronin and a buddy from the Kuro family, or the Akadama clan, or both, dying honorably at the hands of the Meiji army who have come to annex the pass into the government's territory. I skimmed over all of that because, despite there being a really easy and obvious way to add depth to the characters the players will meet over and over while seeking out different endings, every single person in this game is paper thin. Donna wants to be a samurai and marry Suzu. Suzu is a damsel in distress and acts only as a prize to be won. Dojima is just some dude who watches stuff happen, and that's basically it. He used to be in the army, so he knows there's a government spy among the Akadama clan, which, if he didn't know, would mean this entire character lives to be the blacksmith and nothing else. The Akadama clan wants to take over the valley from the Kuro family because one of their leaders is the child of Teshin, the Kuro leader. Like, that's it. The Akadama have no more motivation or pivotal conflicts besides that. Teshin wants to sell land to the government, but the government agent flakes on the deal and decides to take it violently instead. And the game holds all of this stuff back like these are valuable pieces of information that are going to alter how the player is thinking about these people. Like the player is going to become more sympathetic to the Kuro after learning that they want to sell their old steel mill to the government. The Akadama clan could just want territory with residents to extort. Using the word revenge hasn't made that motivation more meaningful. And since the conceit of this whole game is following storylines to their conclusion and then picking up a new one on the next run, I think it's a huge problem that none of the characters are written all that well, and the stories themselves are bland and forgettable. If this were a roguelike, then the weakness of the narrative wouldn't be such an issue. Way of the Samurai's combat could be the star of the show instead. The combat system in Way of the Samurai functions in a similar way to the first Tekken game, of all things. With a drawn sword and an enemy in the Ronin's sights, the player's movements are restricted almost to a 2D line with the option to sidestep. Different attacks are triggered by specific inputs, which not only depend on the type of weapon the player has equipped, but also requires the Ronin to learn them by trying to do them in battle. They never get more complex than 2 or 3 inputs, but that's still in line with the original Tekken movesets. All these attacks don't really change how the combat flows, which is why I said they weren't overly necessary earlier. Different attacks don't combine together, so any attack that lands does its damage, and then the combat resets to neutral. The more impactful combat mechanic is pushing and pulling the opponent to cause them to stumble. I didn't notice any visual indicator for the player to tell whether the enemy was susceptible to a push or a pull, but with enough trial and error, I was able to figure out which enemies were push and which were pull. Picking the correct option causes the enemy to enter a brief period of vulnerability, allowing the player to get an extra hit in. The defender can also push and pull their opponent, keeping this layer of interaction even throughout the more passive moments in combat. The advantage gained from pushes and pulls can be decisive, and it naturally goes both ways. But a problem arises when the player loses too many of these interactions and is killed. The Ronin's death is considered an independent ending, regardless of the tasks the player has completed beforehand. And because the game recognizes an ending has been reached, any save data from the previous run is deleted to allow the player to start over. So if the player pursues a thread all the way to the final showdown and gets unlucky, or makes a mistake, or can't find enough vegetables to eat to heal up, that entire hour of progress is lost, with no way of getting it back. I didn't die too often, but if I was going to die, it'd almost always be right near the ending that I was chasing, which completely killed my motivation to play, and then I'd turn Way of the Samurai off. Eventually, I did see all of the endings, and I saw all of the models in the game, which are okay. It's a PS2 game, but the palette is very bland. This game was released in 2002, the year of Vice City, Metroid Prime, and Morrowind. And while it lacks the scale of these games, Way of the Samurai's visuals are at least on par with the top of the pile. Prime does have phenomenal style and direction over Acquire's game, and I think having Tommy Tallarico on board definitely contributed to Prime's tremendous overall presentation, but I think we should probably stay on topic. Way of the Samurai's character models are solid, and the combat animations are great all around. A genuine achievement. Animation outside of combat is often a bit wooden, and sadly it never gets quite as action figure-y as stuff like Rune, so it's just kind of boring to watch. And most of the environments are plain and boring too. The PS2 can handle much broader palettes, and there are even examples of Japanese forests with a greater range of colourful plants, and even some totally necessary god rays. The rest of the Rokotsu Pass is in decline and generally abandoned, so the muted colours are appropriate. But why the Kuro family live in a big pit in a drab little house is very strange, considering they're supposed to be shaking down the villagers for all their riches. Is the palette being used in a metaphorical way to signify the end of this era of Japanese history? The colours literally holding on to a time that ceases in this very moment? Or did Acquire just go for drab colours because that's how you make things look more realistic? It makes sense for the Akadama clan to be based in a rickety old barn or something, and their mansion is sort of run down. But it's hard to even say if that was a deliberate design choice, or if the game just looks like that. And don't get me started on Kicho's design. It's a badass fit, but it cannot be historically appropriate. Kicho standing there in his black jeans, string vest, and killer jacket, while the Ronin runs around in his kimono is a weird collision of fashion that I'm kind of into. But Kicho might just be the real time traveler here. Way of the Samurai was Acquire's first game on PlayStation 2. It was also the third game the company ever released, and it was their first not to be specifically focused on stealth. The video game industry was doing very well during the early 2000s, with Sony's new console becoming one of the most ubiquitous electronics in homes worldwide. There was plenty of money to be made developing video games, and Acquire had shareholders to satisfy. My cynical brain wants me to say that Way of the Samurai was made to stretch a relatively small budget into a video game with enough content to sate consumers and make out with the highest yield for the company's shareholders. I think most of the combat animations were either made during Acquire's time as a motion capture company or for their Tenchu games. That would explain why the combat looks as smooth and natural as it does, while the conversation scenes have characters' heads swivel around like they're owls. All of the environments are small, lacking in detail, and are reused often. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with reusing assets to make a game. I'd encourage it, actually. Just something about the way Acquire has done it gets my cynicism going. Ultimately, I think Way of the Samurai tried something really interesting and unique, but this first attempt doesn't quite live up to the strength of the idea. RPGs that divide naturally based on whatever choices the player makes are already compelling enough for players to regularly replay games just to see what else they can do. Designing an entire game around that should be a recipe for success. But Way of the Samurai lacks compelling events. I don't need to see the two sides of a dude pushing a pram through the wilderness. Neither eventuality is that exciting, and the short runtime makes discerning between events that lead to particular endings difficult. The Meiji government soldiers are always going to show up at the end, no matter how effective a negotiator the Ronin is. Overall, I don't think Acquire are happy with how this first game ended up, and I've seen that the rest of the series expands a lot on this first attempt, which is good. But, it's also a shame for me, because when do I ever play sequels? This next game is some wild tactics thing.